was on the evolution of whales. But in order to start talking about the evolution of whales, we have to really talk about what exactly a whale is. So first and foremost, a whale is a mammal. It's a warm-blooded vertebrate, that uses its high metabolism to generate heat and regulate its internal temperature. So something that's really cool about the evolution of whales is they actually started off in the water and went to land, which we'll talk about is the start of our phylogeny. But then they did a complete U-turn and went back to water. So it was like water, land, water. And like I said, our phylogeny will start off with when they were on land and work its way back to water. But the first common ancestors of whales and all other living animals in general is the tetrapod that came out of water and went on to land. And it resembles a salamander. And it came onto land at approximately 350 million years ago. And its descendants gradually developed functional limbs. Their fins turned into legs, and they developed hearing in the air instead of in the water. However, like I said before, the whales didn't stay on the land. They then did a complete U-turn and went back into the water. And this transformation from land to water took effect approximately about 50 million years ago. But you might ask why this happened, and there isn't a set hypothesis on why this happened, but after our data, we kind of came up with three that we believe is why it happened.
Okay, so one of the hypotheses for why they returned back to the water was competition for food. So at this time, there was like an explosion of diversity in land-based mammals. So there was a high competition for food, so their solution to that problem was to go to the water. And you might ask, like, why would they go to the water? There's a lot of things and characteristics that mammals have that make them particularly well-suited actually to go into the water. And so these early ancestors that became aquatic kind of took advantage of these characteristics, like being warm-blooded, for example, that allowed them to compete with the animals that were already existing in the aquatic habitat. So being warm-blooded, they're able to maintain this constant environment internally, and so they're able to go to places that other non-mammals like fish and sharks aren't able to go to. For example, like in the North Pole area, where non-mammals can't go to that area and kind of take advantage of the food sources there. The whales and these other early ancestors that were aquatic were able to go to those areas and get available resources. So they were able to compete effectively in that sense. So that's one of the hypotheses for why they went back to the water.
So elaborating more on what John said, his was more about like them being warm-blooded, that kind of led them back into the water because there were no other mammals going back into the water, so they had kind of like a higher up. But going back to what he also said, he was talking about like food and the resources on land. While on land, there was a lot of competition for them for the food and resources. And as we go through our phylogeny, you'll see that a lot of the ancestors ate fish. So they were already trying to prey around water, and they were living around there a lot. So it kind of made sense for them to go back into the water where their food source was. So that's part of like the hypothesis there, that they like went back in there to gain their food. And so as that progressed, they developed, webbed feet and fins, and like it kind of happened because of natural selection and them able to get their food easier. However, another hypothesis that we had is back on land, there might have been a lot of predators for them, feeding on them, because of the fact that the first ones were very semi-aquatic as well as land. So they didn't have characteristics that stood out very well to help them on land and characteristics that helped them to stand out on water. So they were easy targets for other land animals. They weren't very fast like a cheetah, so they were able to be targeted that way. And they weren't very large, as you can see, so they were able to be targeted by other animals. So like them being able to be preyed on by other animals was also a reason why we assumed they might have gone back into the water, because they were able to succeed better there, whereas there were a lot of predators for them on land. So before we go into our phylogeny, because that's the next part of our presentation, I just wanted to point out that we have the phylogeny here, which as you can see, we actually did it more like a model. So it shows like these are the ones that were on land, and the background actually shows how they progressively went into the water. And the ones more in the water are the ones that were actually more aquatic, whereas these ones here were semi-aquatic. So that's the whole point of the background, is to actually visually show you them going into the water. And then around here, we actually have our evidence up on the board, just so we can point it out as we're going through the phylogeny. So these are all of our evidence right here as well. But as you can tell, there are a lot of land animals as well as water animals on here. And so before we go in, we just wanted to discuss a little bit of the similarities between the land animals as well as.
Yeah, so briefly, just kind of like the similarities between these whales and the early whales with other land mammals was in their form of oxygen intake. They all breathe with lungs, and then also with their, like the way they care for their newborn, they take a lot of care of them, and then characteristic of mammals, they feed them milk from the mother, and then also in the warm-bloodedness that I discussed earlier. So,
Starting off with our phylogeny, John.
yes. So here you kind of see this is the very first like common ancestor of this whole part of the phylogeny right here. But then you kind of see an interesting break kind of from the hippo that goes over here. And so the common ancestor isn't known right there at that branch point, but I'll kind of just discuss like where they branched off and kind of how the hippopotamus like fits into that. So the hippopotamus is the closest living relative to modern whales. And so as such, like on this phylogeny, they have some similarities that you can see in the hippo that are in the early ancestors of the whales and in the whales themselves. One thing is a characteristic part of the ankle bone called the astragalus, which is shown right here. The hippos also have that, like some of these early whale ancestors. Also, the eyes and nostrils of the hippo are farther up on the head, which allows them to be submerged, but also see and breathe. So that's kind of similar, and I'll go into more detail with that with some of these early ancestors like the Pakicetus. They were kind of amphibious a little bit. They spent time both in water and on land. And then also hippos mate and give birth underwater, and their young can actually receive milk from the mother underwater. So you're kind of seeing these semi-aquatic characteristics in the hippo, and you can see them kind of parallel to these early ancestors as well.
So, like John said, we don't know the common ancestor, but it did branch off, and right here there's a synapomorphy, and what a synapomorphy is it's common characteristics that are unique just to that clade that happened after the common ancestor. So the synapomorphy for the Indohyus is thick bony wall around the middle ear, and the habitat is fresh water, and it's a semi-aquatic habitat. And so the fossils that were found in the Indohyus were found approximately 47 million years ago. And when they studied the fossils, they found that the oxygen isotopes were lower, significantly lower than for early terrestrial mammals. And so the fossils also show that they were really thick and used for buoyancy, so that shows that they were semi-aquatic, but they weren't fully submerged in the water. And it also showed that they had a really thick cortical bone, which is kind of like the hippo, so it would kind of wade around slowly in the water, as opposed to the living whales right now who have thin cortical bones that help them move quickly into the water. And also their teeth, right here you can see that there are crushing basins on the teeth, and this kind of shows what they were feeding on. So they were partially on the land, and they were feeding on more like carnivorous foods that they needed these thick bones for, that are later aren't present in future animals.
Yeah, so moving down the tree to here, the Pakicetus was one of the earlier ancestors of that common ancestor, and it was primarily land, but it was semi-aquatic also. So kind of some things that you see that in the fossil evidence that point to those things are the Pakicetus has a long skull, and the teeth are they have these basins like she was talking about, And so you can see that from those teeth that they, kind of the contact of the teeth, the way they come together, points to that they fed on organisms like fish, and they were carnivorous. And so kind of seeing with this amphibious lifestyle also, the eye sockets, the orbits for this animal are high up on the side of the skull, and they're close together, which kind of reflects the thing somewhat similar to the hippo, as they're able to stay submerged but kind of, be able to see above water some. And that's also kind of like the way crocodiles work also, how they're kind of able to be submerged still but see over the water for predation. Also, you see that the nasal opening on this animal is closer to the snout, and that's another characteristic that kind of develops as you go down the phylogeny, and you see this change to the modern whale, but it started at the tip of the snout. And also, I mean, you see that it's mainly a land animal, but it has these hind limbs, and so it's kind of similar to a wolf. They were similar in size to a wolf, and scientists think that they use quadrupedal pedaling, kind of like doggy paddle, to move in the water. So that's just kind of some beginning characteristics as we see the kind of morphing to what the modern whale is from the land animal.
Okay, so moving on, the next one that we have is the synapomorphy right here that affects the ambulocytus, as well as the next one's coming in. So this synapomorphy right here was a large, powerful tail, which you can see right here. It also was shorter legs, which you can obviously see again. It was a fat pad in the jaw for hearing underwater. And then this animal in particular lived in a brackish water habitat. So now that was the synapomorphy here, but going more into the ambulocytus, it was the first semi-aquatic animal, so all the ones before were primarily land, whereas this one was more into the water, as you can see by its webbed feet that it's getting. And its name actually means a walking whale that swims. So you can see there that it's obviously semi-aquatic because that's its name, walking whale that swims. And its forelimbs were equipped with fingers and hooves, so that allowed it to walk on the land, whereas its hind feet were clearly adapted for water. And for swimming, it swam by paddling with its legs and dived by tugging its forelimbs and giving powerful kicks with its hind limbs. So the front legs were more for walking on land, whereas the back was more for swimming. And it heard sound, like I said, through the lower jawbone, which, like I said before, at the synapomorphy was the fat pad in the jaw for hearing. And the sound passed through the jaw, from the jaw, through soft tissues leading to the ear. And this actually foreshadows the remarkable sound receiving system used by modern toothed whales. So that's something that you can actually see then leads the way for the whales that we see now. So that's kind of a connection that you can see there. Something else that's really interesting about this whale is it had a tail, but it had no flukes. So you'll see that later develop in the more recent ancestors, as well as it ate fish, which you can see by its teeth. So that's a common pattern that it got from the land animals. And then it being semi-aquatic, it actually likely drank both freshwater and saltwater. So all the ones before it drank freshwater, whereas you'll start to see that all the ones after drank saltwater. And so this was the ancestor whale that was in the middle of the two. And the evidence that has helped to support this is the isotopes of oxygens found in a fossil in its bone, which the diagram here actually shows the isotopes there. But research has shown that by looking at the fossils, they found the isotopes varied and led to them believing that they drank both freshwater and saltwater. So yeah, that's the ambulocytus.
So the next mammal is the Cucucetus. And as you were saying, the synapomorphy for here is saltwater habitat, and so the isotopes are shown here. That gives evidence that they lived in a saltwater habitat. And also, the fossils show that the nasal opening is starting to move back on the head, which kind of foreshadows what we know now as the blowhole that's on the back. It's not quite there yet, but it's moving back. And also, the fossils suggest that the vision was poor and the hearing was the main scents that they used, and you can see that here, that the eyes are really, the eyes are kind of small and the ears were prominent. And there were channels of sound that they had a promontorium where the cochlea was located, and they also had a fat pad, like Sierra said, that was used for underwater hearing. And this shows that they're kind of moving into the water, not quite there yet, but they're starting to get characteristics that help them out in the water.
Okay, and moving from that part of the tree down to here, the synapomorphy that was looked at right here that broke off was the shifting back, as she mentioned, of the nasal opening, which you can see in this picture. An interesting thing about that particular animal is that it kind of exhibited an intermediate movement back to the like in the skull with the nostril opening, because the Pakicetus had kind of at the tip of the snout, and then here you're kind of seeing it in the midline more so, and then finally with the whale it goes back to where the blowhole is, and you can see that development as they become more aquatic, that the nostrils are moving back farther, which allows them to breathe easier because they don't have to lift their snout up to be able to breathe while they're in the water. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why that was developing. Another synapomorphy that happened there was the movement of the eyes kind of to the side of the head, which allowed them to see laterally in the water, and also to so that like the direct current of the water wasn't in their eyes. So that kind of shows also that they were more of an aquatic animal as compared to these other organisms that move up the tree. Some other characteristics of that, the Rhodocetus, was that they have the shorter neck, and that's because the vertebral column there was shortening, kind of stabilizing the neck for swimming. And then the ear region near the skull was more specialized for the underwater hearing as they formed those fat pads in that area. And so this animal was mostly, like, almost completely aquatic, but it did have these kind of hind limbs here. And they had some land locomotion, but based on evidence from fossils that the feet were much larger than the hands, that they were slow and cumbersome on land. So that kind of points to more the aquatic lifestyle that they led. And also a noteworthy thing is the development of this very strong, the hind limbs here and then the tail. And so that kind of, you're seeing more fossil evidence that's widely distributed in this organism, as you're finding more fossils in like Africa, Asia, North America, and South America. So that shows that they had these very strong limbs and tail that allowed them to reach these farther away areas and occupy different niches. But they didn't have the development of the tail fluke quite yet, which later helped them farther down the phylogenetic tree.
Right, so the synapomorphy here is pretty significant. There's some changes that make them look more like what we think of whales. So one of the most important one is the tail fluke. So you can kind of see it here. Another one is the really small hind limbs, and the nasal opening is starting to shift back. So the fossils suggest that they had a tail fluke. It's kind of hard to tell because there's no tail fluke bone, but what we can see is that the vertebrae are very similar to what we see in living mammals here that do have the tail fluke. They're more flattened. And the fossils also show that they have the ability to lock their elbows, and this was really beneficial for them when they would paddle through the water. They could go against the current, and it was really helpful for them. They also showed that we don't really know because of the fossils whether the hind limbs were external or not. We know that they were internal, but they really weren't very functional. But it just kind of shows how we got from here, that they did at one time have hind limbs that they used, but at this point they're not functional.
Next, with this one, very similar to it, is the Basilosaurus. And the Basilosaurus is one that we actually, they just recently more so found. And it was one that they were waiting on to be able to connect more so the beginning of the phylogeny to the very end. Because as previously stated, they had known that like these had the hind legs, and they knew that somewhere around here the hind legs disappeared, but they didn't have that connecting part to it to like connect both of them. So actually Philip Gingrich was out looking in the desert for fossils, which as you can see most of our evidence is fossil because that's how they've been able to do the evolution of whales. It's been through fossil evidence primarily. And he actually found a Balasaurus fossil with the hind leg in it, which you can see right here. Here's the foot, and this is the hind leg right here. So that was kind of a groundbreaking thing that they were able to be like, we can finally connect it all. But to talk more about the Basilosaurus, I think, sorry.
That's okay.
Is it Basilosaurus?
I think so.
Basilosaurus, okay. The Basilosaurus is fully adapted to aquatic life, so that's why it's fully submerged in the water, because at this point, they're aquatic animals. It had sturdy flippers and a long, flexible body, as you can see as it's like moving up. However, like I said, it still had weak hind legs, but the hind legs, it wouldn't have been able to walk on land with. It was just kind of something that was there, which again can show you how it was related to land animals before. And they were as large as modern whales, so that shows you a connection to the modern whales. However, something that was different between them and modern whales, which you'll actually see develop between these two, is they lacked the melon organ, which allows modern whales to use echolocation effectively. So they couldn't use echolocation effectively. And the Basilosaurus also had a small brain, and that suggests that they may have been solitary creatures, meaning like they kind of grew up on their own, like stayed to themselves, and they weren't as social as the modern whales, so that kind of shows the difference between them. But the Basilosaurus was just really important because it was able to connect everything, but these two are very similar.
And next we have a snapmorphy right here, and that's showing the complete loss of the hind limbs in the blowhole. And this is like what we know as living whales today. And then the snapmorphy here is echolocation for hunting, and this made them like, they're aquatic and they have this adaptation for the water where they can identify prey very easily, and they're very well adapted. And so the fossils show that the hind limbs are completely internal, like we know whales today. And they're also able to process sound by passing sound waves through the mandible to channel the lateral side of the tympanic bone. And then also for the masticetes, what's the synapomorphy here is the baleen, and this shows like these are completely different whales. They have like a completely different ecological niche. They have baleen, so they're going to feed on a completely different prey than these whales. And kind of in closing, this is just a hypothesis based on the current evidence. Like before they found the Basilosaurus, they really couldn't connect all this together, but this is how we think whales evolved, but as new evidence comes along, this could change.
Yeah, like you'll see other ones and it'll have other names on here as well, but this was the one that we primarily saw consistent. But just in closing, we just wanted to go over the major differences between the animals that were land as well as the animals that were water. So with breathing, both the ancestors that were land and water, they both breathed air, as well as with nursing, as John said earlier, both nursed with milk. When they were drinking, the ones that were first, they drank with fresh water, as previously said, and the ones at the end drank with salt water. Eating the land ones primarily ate, like we said, like fish. Some, however, ate plants, so it was plants and animals. And then as it went more, it was fish and plankton. And then moving, these ones were primarily walking, running, some would swim, and then the water ones were primarily swimming. And with swimming, when the land animals that were that did swim, they would paddle with their limbs, whereas the water would push with the tail fluke, which is seen here. The tail fluke would move up and down versus side to side like a fish, because it did come from a land animal that has the backbone of it, so that's why it moved up and down, because of that bone versus side to side. And there are a couple more as well.
Yeah, so a few more things are kind of like in sensing their environment around them. The land mammals here were primarily using light in their eyes to sense things around them, whereas in the water they started to use their ears and sound with the echolocation kind of sense things in their environment. Also, with communicating on land, they use sound more with light, and then water, they use the sound kind of like similar with the sensory. And then in hearing, the land animals have this tympanic membrane, while the water have a tympanic bone. And then with the temperature regulation, the land animals have the hair and fur that's characteristic of mammals, but as they go aquatic, they have this blubber, this insulatory like blubber layer. And then mating on land, they usually mate on land and then water in water, but there are a few semi-aquatic animals that would mate on water and then go back to land, but that's just kind of in the transition that you see there. And then lastly, in giving birth, the land animals gave birth head first, and then the water animals gave birth tail first. So those are just kind of a few highlighted major differences as you go down the phylogenetic tree here.
So yeah, this is our club.
All right, questions?
So like the first thing at the top is like more honest mammal, but like kind of like and I wouldn't say like a rodent, but like a furry creature kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, they compare these to like a wolf, kind of. Those ones.
Those first two, yeah, they compare them kind of like similar in size to a
I
wolf.
would have never thought that.
Right.
This was really interesting to us.
Very interesting.
It's something I never thought about before.
Yeah, like when you think of like a water animal, you think of originating from a water animal, and you would have assumed it would have been like a fish to a whale, because like that would make sense. But
You wouldn't think that Dingo would be the closest living.
relative to there. But like after doing all the research, it's really interesting to see, like as we explained it, you can obviously see physically and like through our evidence how it transitioned from here to all the way down to there, just through like little tiny steps that eventually went along
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering, because obviously there's a lot of strong fossil data, which has shed a lot of light, but in your research, did you find anything, doing embryology or anecdotal like
No, there. You want to go ahead?
Well, yeah, there were a few things that I saw, like when you're comparing the early embryos of these kind of like the modern whales and then some of these other ones, you see that there's similarities when they're first developing. Like with the whales, when the embryo is first developing, the nostrils actually start at the snout and then they move back in the embryo, which is pretty cool. And then also with the whales, they have these hind buds that in other like land animals eventually become the like hind limbs, but the whales kind of lose this bud that happens during the embryonic stage. So I mean, there's a few things there that they see kind of that is able to kind of bring together and bridge that gap a little bit.
And I was gonna say, and I know that there was embryonic data that we found. However, there was significantly more fossil evidence, and there was, it was more strongly supported. So we wanted to go with the more strongly supported data.
I was just going to ask, the light blue picture and the purple picture, like the border of it, like with your phylogeny, yeah, those two. No, I mean the light blue and the purple, yeah, those two. It kind of, I'm just asking, they kind of look like, because that one's got pretty long limbs compared to the one before it, right?
Don't they look like they should be flipped?
Yeah, do you have any?
Yeah, no, that's like initially when I first looked at this, I thought of that. And when you really look at it, like obviously this one has like the longer tail. However, you can see that its leg is more of like just like a limb kind of thing, whereas this one it developed more of like the outstretched, able for it to be in water. So that was more of like the data that was found in. But I thought the same exact thing. But when doing all the research, they all led to it being that it was this route. And the synaptomorphy here, I think Sally touched on, right? Or here, I'm sorry, here.
Yeah, that was
That was the saltwater, yeah. So the main difference between these two is that it went from being in primarily like the salt water. So that was the difference between.
And you can see the difference in the tails. So this tail's really thick for paddling, but you can see that this bridges the transformation from the tail to the fluke.
but the picture obviously shows.
Yeah, because one of the things with this one was, like she said with the fluke, there wasn't a lot of fossil evidence for that one with the fluke, but that was kind of like the next step to developing the fluke was in that organism there. And you can see kind of that it was a really good swimmer because of these features that it got, because of just the wide distribution of fossils that they saw that were from that particular animal, as opposed to that one.
All right, thank you.